Good day to you. How many of you in this class come from a family of immigrants? Yeah, trick question. We all do, right? That's what America is. Unless you're a Native American, which has pretty much been disintegrated, the Native American population, and pushed into the larger population that developed here in the US, unless you're of Native American heritage, you're from an immigrant family, like me. My parents came over from Britain. They came over after World War II because conditions in Britain were pretty bleak after World War II. I mean, they were taking housing from people to find places for others to live, places for people like my mom who had her house bombed out. A bomb dropped 7 houses down from her and it wiped out her house, and she was living with friends and relatives for a good 7 years. So we have things like this in our house, right? This is a coat of arms for me. It's the Mackenzie coat of arms, and there's a family history there, and the words up top say Luceo non Euro, which means I shine, not burn. And you have stuff in your house too, right? And as I walk through my house here, you'll have little glimpses and pieces of the cultures that have come over from other countries throughout your life. The style of the plates that you have in your house, the paintings, the kind of music that you're playing around your house, and of course food, which we often talk about. So today's class is all about immigration and culture. We're going to focus on the US to some extent, since we are the largest immigration country in the world, if you want to call us that. We have more immigrants than any other nation of the 200 nations in this world. But in general, we're going to talk about what it's like to leave a country behind, to cross over a border, and to go into another. I use border and I use country, but we're really talking about crossing over into another culture. And whether you do it for a short period, a long period, etc., that's what we're going to cover today. So let's do that now. I mean, the quick and easy way to go to another country is as a tourist. And we do that in the U.S. I would say that we are less free-spirited in the U.S. than we are in other countries. I mean, when we take our trips, we like them to be catered, because we get such little vacation time, 2 weeks a year, that we pretty much like to have everything arranged. So we go to all-inclusive resorts, we take cruises, we go on tour packages, and we generally do our stuff in controlled settings. Versus making your own plane flight, getting your own hotel, taking a chance on the hotel, going there without any real structured plan. You're just going to hang out with locals, eat where they eat, etc. We don't do that as much, but tourism is that first level of going to another country. And then after that, we have something called a sojourn. I don't know why the book uses that. It's a French word. Sojourner is what they call it. You know, a sojourn is when you spend time in another country for an extended period. Now, you can define that as you want, but I'm going to say like 3 months, probably minimum. I've done that in England. Been to Sweden so many times, it almost seems like a sojourn. I lived there, I guess the longest would be like 2 months at a time. Mexico, for sure. We have a second house down there. We saved up a lot of our money and got that house we remortgaged our house here in Pennsylvania, so we would have a place that gets us into another culture. And you probably have had the chance to do an extended vacation maybe, but I don't know about a sojourn. Then we have another category of person, that's the expatriate, also referred to as the expat. That's somebody who no longer lives in a country. A lot of times it's through the military going around to other countries, and military service people meet others in other countries, settle down in those other countries. I have a student, Marinda, who did an internship in Mexico, and she's now living in Spain. She's kind of an expatriate. Normally, expatriate has something to do with a kind of your relation to the state that you've left. You maybe don't agree with it, or an opposite to that, you have a strong affiliation with it. I mean, there's expatriates for Brits all over the world. And if you go to South Africa and Australia, and even Canada, you still find them putting the Queen on money in Canada, on the currency, the Canadian dollar. You have the English Queen, Queen Elizabeth. Those are expatriates. They have a strong affinity for their country, so country's usually involved there. Then we also have the refugee and the asylee, kind of similar situations, but different at the same time. The refugee is a person who is fleeing a country normally because they can't sustain themselves there, that they can't grow what they need, can't find a job, there's disease, etc. Whereas an asylee is somebody who has been is leaving the country for political reasons. There's a regime change, and they can't practice their religious beliefs, and so they have to leave the country. That's kind of a typical situation. All right, and then now I'd like to move on to the concept of culture shock. Culture shock, it speaks for itself, right? It's the idea that when you're in another culture, you're in a kind of state of shock. You're kind of like, you're lost in some ways. You don't know what to do. It's a surprise to you. You can't make sense of your world around you. It's confusing to you. It's causing some tension. Cultural shock occurs also at very different phases. The initial phase is like the honeymoon phase. When you first arrive in a country, like I'm taking my students to Sweden in July, and I know when we arrive in Sweden, they're going to be like, oh, it's so clean, it's so magical, it's so and everything is going to be euphoric in a way. It's going to be amazingly different. But then often, if you stay longer in another culture, you come to the disintegration of familiar cues phase. And here you're starting to be aware that things around you are communicated in a different way. So you go to catch a bus in Sweden versus catching a bus here in Stroudsburg, which actually comes up this street, Analomic Street. I don't know if we'll pass one on my walk here right now. But you have to go to the stop, the bus stop. And you don't know when the bus is coming in East Stroudsburg. You got to kind of wait. And if it's late, you just wait. You don't really know. I mean, I suppose you could track it with an app. But in Sweden, you automatically have an LED readout at every bus stop. And it's telling you the next bus going to Saylorsburg is arriving in 1 minute. It's a completely different way of communicating. Now, in this case, it would be more pleasurable, conceivably, because you want to know when the bus is coming. So familiar cues is really what this is about. It's the disintegration of those. They're the kinds of things that we used to count on as normal things in our daily life. Even something like drinking coffee, right? You drink coffee in France. Oh my God, what a different experience. Oh, there's some pennies on the ground. This is my background, right? I'm Scottish. I'm going to pick them up. I know people throw away pennies. Got 4 of them. So anyway, coffee in France, you get your coffee in a bowl and you dip your croissant in it. That's how you drink coffee in France. How weird is that, right? Totally a different familiar cue. Then also we have the reintegration of new cues as the next phase in culture shock. And so now we are adopting the other culture's ways of communicating. When I go to Mexico, I'm saying adios. I'm saying ¿cómo estás? I'm smiling a little bit more because that's what goes on in Mexico. There's more smiling that goes on. I'm slowing down. I'm not rushing to be the first person in line. I'm taking my time. These are all things that are Mexican cues, not necessarily East Coast cues, that are now reintegrating themselves into my life when I go to Mexico. Then we have this phase called gradual adjustment. It takes time. You'll go through homesickness. You'll miss the things at home, TV shows, whatnot. People that you like, your family, etc. But you adjust. You learn to lay in that bed and feel anxious. You learn to be lonely. You learn to be frustrated that you haven't had a message returned that you sent out. These are things that we learn to come to accept, and that's why it's called gradual adjustment. And then eventually we reach a stage, hopefully, called biculturalism. Biculturalism is an interesting concept because it implies, well, it directly states, I should say, that you are not giving up your own culture by living in a new culture. That there are elements of it that you still have that's part of your life that are balanced well with elements that are going on in your new culture, new ways of celebrating, new holidays, new foods, etc. We'll get to that a little bit more in a few minutes. All right, and then now we come to the opposite of culture shock, and that's reverse culture shock. And I can tell you my parents went through this at least 3 times officially in my life. And that's when you return to your original culture after having been on a sojourn or as an expat in another culture, and now you have shock the other way. I mean, what an incredible irony, right? Going back to your original country and being shocked by the culture because you've become a different person in the other culture. My parents moved back to Britain 2 times in my lifetime. And also that means back to the United States. So when I was a 15-year-old, they moved there 3 times. When I was a 15-year-old, they moved to the south of England, pulled me out of high school. We went over there. Houses were smaller. It was more difficult to do the things that the kids love, like play baseball. The music was much more pop-oriented. The food was not as gluttonous as America. The portions were smaller. There were just a lot of things that as kids did not adapt to. So the parents moved us back to America. But guess what had happened? We had already started to feel like we were becoming British people in a way. So now when we come back to America as a 15-year-old, I'm kind of pissed off that I can't drink a shandy. You know what a shandy is? A shandy is a drink that they make in England to help educate people on alcohol. And it's a combination of like apple cider and a little bit of alcohol in it, like 2%. So that you get introduced to the alcohol slowly and you don't develop a binge drinking mentality. When I came back to the US, I couldn't find that. So I was like, hey, I was allowed to do this in England. So reverse culture shock is when you go back to your own country and it doesn't fit there either. But that causes growth, right? Because then you start to believe that you're really a person who's a citizen of the world. At least that's what I think. That you can adapt in any country, in any culture. You just need the experience of it, right? All right, so now the book goes to various countries that it focuses on. Some it's looked at before. It talks about, for example, Israel. Interesting country, Israel, because it has an ethnic and a religious directive that is actually encouraging immigration, right? So it's a country that has very strong forces at play to create immigration into Israel, like the Aliyah. This is that term that refers to the ascending into Israel. And notice it's not crossing over into Israel. It's ascending, right? Going up. And that's very specifically by design to create a kind of a reckoning with a deity, right? So that's what that's about. And then you also have the law of return. That's what it's called, 1970. You can return back to Israel if you were a person who was chased out for your beliefs or felt that it was an inhospitable place. You can return. And then you also have this idea that if you are born to a Jewish mother, you are Jewish. That's the definition of a Jew at its core. So all of these forces together have created a lot of people practicing the Jewish faith across the world, including in such far reaches as Ethiopia and the Soviet Union, but also encouraging immigration back to the country of Israel, which is a tiny country. Next up is Western Europe. Western Europe, what it's going through right now is an interesting phase. Usually in the past, when you talk about immigration and Western Europe, you talk about immigration or emigration. Did you know there was a term emigration that means leaving from, EM? Mostly Western Europe was supplying immigrants to the rest of the world, right? Here in the US, we'll talk about that in a minute. We got a lot of Western Europeans that came here. But in the recent past, 20 years, 30 years, and especially the last 10 years, because of the wars that are going on in different places in the Middle East, Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, you have a lot of Muslims who have left and who have gone to Europe. And it's created a lot of problems. I don't know if you knew about the Danish cartoons that came out that depicted Muhammad, which is a no-no, as we've already discussed, depicted a visual representation of him. That caused a lot of outrage. And we do have, several incidents that are related to terrorism that are then also automatically, not necessarily correctly, but automatically tied to the Islamic faith. So there's a lot of tension in Europe right now. It's really small countries in the past that have existed on their own and had just a really nice setup, very good cost of living, quality of life, people happy. Countries, like Finland, Denmark, Norway, Holland, great quality of life, very happy on the happiness index. But now these countries have received a lot of Muslim immigrants, and they're re-examining whether they should have as open border of a policy as they've had in the past. And Holland now requires immigrants to be able to speak the Dutch language. All right, then we have Brazil. Brazil, I don't know how much you know about Brazil. It's a huge country, 5th largest in the world. U.S. is 3rd, China 4th, Brazil 5th. The language there is Portuguese. It was settled by Portugal. Portugal was one of the early colonial powers in the 1500s, sailing its navy around the world. And it got to Brazil, and the language got established there. So it's kind of odd in that way, but it's surrounded by Spanish-speaking countries. Speaking Portuguese does not mean you can speak Spanish. You can understand some very basics, but they are totally different languages. Also, we have the population of Brazil by an incredible proportion of slaves compared with the rest of the world. 4 million slaves. We had in the hundreds of thousands in the United States. Brazil, 4 million African slaves, which is an integral part of Brazilian culture today. And then there are several waves of immigrants that went to Brazil. You can read about those on your own. People go and into Brazil from Europe for various reasons, after wars, seeking a fresh start. Then we come to the United States. The United States, a country we should know a lot about, right? We know it has the most immigrants in the entire world. How amazing is that? We know that in the beginning, Massachusetts was looking for immigrants that had a kind of moral purity in line with Protestantism. That's what the Puritans were all about. We know that Virginia and Maryland were looking for cheap labor. They just really wanted immigrants to come in and work for less than the people who were living here, and that's why they were also susceptible to slavery, which was no cost, so to speak, economically. I hope you understand what I mean there. And then we also have, with the United States, we have Pennsylvania. A very interesting state, Pennsylvania, in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, which then served as the model for the rest of the states in terms of how fairly do you treat immigrants. And the model in Pennsylvania is if you're an immigrant and you get citizen, you're an equal citizen to the other citizens who are already there. And that was not the case in terms of in Virginia with slavery and others, but it became the model for the rest of the nation. Good old Pennsylvania right there. We have some laws ourselves that have changed our immigration patterns. We've got some really early laws, like we got the 1798 Act Concerning Aliens law, and that started to limit the kinds of people that could come into the country, disqualified if they were prostitutes, etc. We also have that taking place in the 1878 law, barring convicts and prostitutes from coming to the country. But then, as we've mentioned several times, and need to highlight again, because this is probably the chapter where it has its deepest discussion and connection to intercultural communication, we have a long history of slavery in this country. And the way that the slaves were dispersed across the country were related to this history. So in the South, we had legalized slavery, and you have a lot of African American population still today in the Deep South. But then we had migration of slaves seeking the abolition of slavery, and emancipation, seeking freedom, coming up to places like East Stroudsburg, right? I don't know if you know the street called Broadhead Avenue. If you go down to Broadhead Avenue it's Braeside, not Broadhead Avenue, Braeside, Braeside. There's a house there on the corner. You can see it, you'll recognize it. It looks like a plantation house, a French country house, old house. That allegedly was an underground railroad house. That's a house that would secretly hide African Americans coming from the South to get them to freedom. So, interesting. But that's part of the migration of African Americans in the United States. It's also why we have a lot of African Americans, a disproportionate amount compared to other ethnicities in big cities, because African Americans felt more safety in the density of population. So they go to places where there are already large clusters of people, where they also could get work, where they would be more accepted. It would be a while before they would be able to be able to achieve more equality in terms of respect. But these were the most hospitable places for African Americans, were the big cities. Now, if you live here in Pennsylvania or New York or New Jersey, I hope you get a chance at some point to go to Ellis Island in New York. Ellis Island, about half of the population of the U.S. came through Ellis Island. That's the processing center. It's a really cool exhibit. You'll take a little ferry out to the island, walk around, and you'll see what the average person was like coming to New York City with just a suitcase or just the clothes on their back, how they were processed, how their names were misspelled because the people taking the records didn't always have literacy themselves. And you can see the plight of mostly poor people coming to the United States for a fresh start. But they came here knowing, or at least believing that they could practice a religion when they got here of their choice, in their own way. We have different waves ourselves of immigrants here in the United States, and in Pennsylvania is very typical of the German and Irish population that came here. We have a lot of Germans, we have a lot of Irish. You go down to Main Street, Stroudsburg, where I was last night. There's 3 bar restaurants that have an Irish theme to them. That's speaking to that part of the population that came to Pennsylvania and is trying to retain the Irish heritage. We even have an Irish mementos shop.
And you can see German too, like Stroudsburg. Berg is a very German word. And if you go out throughout Lancaster County and you see the Amish, who actually came from Switzerland, but they have a Germanic tradition, Germanic heritage, hardworking labor, solemn people, blonde, a sturdy physical build. I'm stereotyping, of course, but we can see that in our population here in Pennsylvania. Then we have Italians. A lot of Italians came to Pennsylvania, again, seeking, after World War II, seeking a better life. And all of these immigrants, Irish, Germans, and Italians, were looked at in a pejorative way when they arrived here. They were looked at as the Italians are the ones who brought X disease. The Irish are drunks. This is the way that these early immigrants were perceived. And living in poor neighborhoods as a reflection of that, and big cities like New York before, they were, I guess you can say, pushed up by other waves of immigrants, Hispanic immigrants, Chinese immigrants. In fact, we have a lot of Mexicans here in the United States, not so much in PA, but you can find some Mexican workers. I went to a nursery last week, he's Mexican. These are the kinds of jobs that he's going and he's getting the plants that people want and putting them in their cars. We have a lot of Mexicans that are coming here and working in labor jobs that are in the countryside, I should say. They work in contracting, they pick vegetables and fruits. And I got to tell you, there's a reason for that. Mexicans are really hard workers. They're not fast workers. You won't see them running around a job like we would expect a Pennsylvania person. But you will see Mexicans working steadily all day long for 5.5 days. And they will work from 10 o'clock in the morning until 7 o'clock at night. And just doing very manual. When I watch the Mexican workers in Mexico building stuff, they are carrying huge buckets of cement, tiny ladders that they've made out of their own wood to a rooftop. And they're working in the blistering sun in full clothing. It's amazing. Absolutely amazing. In the 2000s, the U.S. had a lot of Asian immigrants, a lot of people coming from China, still happening today. U.S. is here in ESU. We're trying to bolster our student enrollment here by gaining more Chinese students and other students from around the world. You might be surprised that the largest contributing country of students to ESU is Saudi Arabians. Saudi Arabians, because they have a government program that pays for them because of their oil wealth. All right, now let's move on to what will predict whether acculturation takes place. Acculturation is a term that's referred to, you blend into the culture and you feel okay. You don't feel like you're out of place. You feel like, okay, this is my new home and I'm okay with it. And I have parts of my past from my other culture and I have new parts of me from this new culture. That's acculturation. There was a researcher named Young Kims, Y-U-N Kims, and he came up with a cross-cultural model. And he said that there were really 5 things that have to take place for acculturation to take place. So the first one is a host communication competence. And that means a basic ability to understand the communication in the culture, which means usually, but not always because of the internet today, knowing the country's language, being able to speak the language. If you move to another country, you never take on that language because you live in a community of just Chinese people or just Hispanic people, then you're not going to get past this first stage. Which is starting to understand what the communication means that takes place in the culture you're at. After that, it comes to participation and host social communication. All right, so what that means now is now you're at the next level where you are actually participating in the environment in some fun ways. You're able to watch a TV show in a foreign language, used to be foreign, now you speak it, and you're enjoying it. It's a comedy. You're laughing, okay? You're not cut off from that because you're participating in the host's social communication. And you're going out with friends, and they're talking in this native language that is native to them, that's foreign to you, but now you're understanding that they're making fun of somebody they saw in the grocery store, or they're talking about what the weather forecast is going to be later and what that means for what they're going to be wearing. You're participating socially. And after that comes a third phase, which is participating in the ethnic social communication in the foreign country. Now, what does that mean? That means that you are still in touch with others like you, who have come to the new country, and you are sharing some of your values that belong to the older country. So I wonder what it's like for Professor Cem Zeytnoglu in my department. He came from Turkey, and that's a country where you find very few immigrants from, unless you go to Germany. There you have a lot of Turkish immigrants there. So I'm not really sure what it's like for him. I'm sure he has. I know that there's a Turkish enclave, a community outside of Paterson, New Jersey. I know that he goes there sometimes, but I know that he has Turkish friends here. That's all part of participating in that ethnic social communication in the new place. Then you have the phase called host environment. And this is the phase where you are now feeling very comfortable in your new place. You go around all day, you're learning through the foreign language, you're speaking to people, your thinking has changed, because thinking is related to the language that we speak. We've established that with I love you versus you love, etc. And then that lastly takes you to a predisposition phase. And the predisposition phase, it has to do with you actually are looking forward to being in that culture. It's something that makes you feel like you are going to achieve even better things in your life than you have. It's a positive experience. All right, now we come to the kinds of terms to finish out our instructor video today, which will describe the balance that you basically achieve when you go to a new country, the balance between your past versus your present, and what the future holds for you. So the ultimate is acculturation. We've talked about that. You're bicultural, and you're living in this new country. You have your old culture, you have new culture, great balance. But a worse condition is marginalization. Marginalization is a very lonely situation. You know, when you're in the margin, you're on the outside of the page, right? That's where that word comes from. It's a book term. So if you're marginalized in society, not only do you feel cut off from the new society people that you are around, not only do you feel cut off from them, but you also are cut off from the other people who have come to this country who are like you, immigrants from another country. And so you feel isolated. You're not meeting them in community get-togethers. You're not passing them at the store when you go shopping. You're not celebrating holidays. In Mexico, if you're a female, you have a song that's just for you. And at some point, when you turn 16, I think it is, you're going to have a troubadour band outside singing your song to you. Is that something that you just give up forever when you go to your new country? But also, you're not participating in that country's way of recognizing birthdays either. That's marginalization. And then we have separation and segregation. That's like the Chinatowns here in the United States. Those people are living almost like they're in China. Certainly with the look and the feel and the foods. I'm not exactly sure about, to go too much deeper because I'm not Chinese, but if you go to Chinatown in Philadelphia, Chinatown in New York, it looks like it could have been airlifted from a small town in China. And that is separation and segregation. You have enough people that you can create your own mini society that is kind of impenetrable to the larger culture. And that leaves you with a separation and segregation situation. And then next up you have assimilation. That's where you start to blend into the culture. And that step is followed by integration. And what's different about assimilation and integration is assimilation is where you are blending into the culture and you are losing more of yourself because you are assimilating into the new culture. Whereas integration is you are bringing with you traditions, values from your old culture that do then get incorporated into the new culture. So my dad tried unsuccessfully when we were kids to stop us from talking at the dinner table because that's the way that he was raised. So he brought that into the United States, and for a while it was integration. We had to be quiet at the dinner table. We had to eat our salad first, and then after that, it kind of went away because that's not the norm in American society, and he learned that he couldn't control that after a while. So it's integration sometimes takes place, sometimes does not. Here in the United States, as a very final quick example, President Trump went to France a little while ago, and he witnessed a military parade on Bastille Day. Bastille Day is a historical day in France that commemorates a prison uprising and the overthrow of the monarchy. And President Trump wants to have a military parade for him in the United States. You could call that integration if he's successful with that. All right, so that's going to wrap up immigrants across the United States, which is to say us. Have a great day.